He says, in the 1989 to 1990 National Health Survey, Lifestyle and Health Australia, tobacco smokers had lowest rates of cardiovascular disease, hypertension, diabetes, neoplasm, and strongest no illness category.
Tobacco's interesting. One of the groups which have the highest smoking rates per capita are pygmies. This gives us very valuable insights into the evolution of tobacco smoking, because tobacco smoking seems to have been a mechanism for controlling parasite load. If you look at nicotinoids, which are the class of plant toxins, which are basically the active ingredient in tobacco, plants evolved nicotinoids as a way of avoiding insect herbivory. So insects which would nibble on tobacco leaves died. Nicotinoids are extremely toxic to insects. They're extremely toxic to all forms of elements as well. There was an interesting paper called Plants, Parasites and People many years ago, looking at the part of a selective sequelae of slow life history traits in northern and easterly populations. And one of the things they found, one of the strongest predictors of slow life history, was boreal forests. It turns out that boreal forests, particularly with trees which are seasonal, where the trees periodically shed their leaves and drop the leaves onto the ground. So these are not evergreens or conifers. These would be other trees you find mixed in with conifers. You find that these trees actually, they do chemical warfare on the insects and the parasites living in the rhizosphere, that is the soil volume around the roots, by carpet bombing the soil with these leaves which contain nicotinoids and tannins and other things which are highly toxic to parasites. And what happened is this reduced the parasite load in the environment to a point where you can then have selection pressures favoring slow life history traits among human populations living in those environments, taking advantage of that natural chemical warfare that's being waged by plants on parasites. And it's the same with the consumption of nicotine directly as a smoking product or as something that you eat. It has a huge effect on your parasite burden. So, if you're in a population where you're not likely to live long enough on average to suffer lung cancer, which is a disease of all ages associated with chronic smoking, then the benefits to smoking far outweigh the costs.
I have a friend who's a doctor, and he smokes the occasional cigar. And he argues that smoking the occasional cigar is better for you than not smoking at all.
Well, there's a theory called hormesis. Hormesis is the idea that small exposures to substances which in high doses are dangerous in some way creates a kind of resistance that fortifies you physiologically. And the jury is out on whether or not hormesis works. But the idea is that, take for example, ionizing radiation. There's some tentative evidence that low-level exposure to ionizing radiation is actually good for you because it helps build up a resistance to radiation. And there's a couple of ways it can do this. Low doses of ionizing radiation might function as a kind of low-grade radiotherapy. It might destroy senescent cells, which have been hanging around for too long. It might destroy precancerous cells or even cells which are at a very early stage of oncogenesis. That is grade 0 neoplasms, which would be cancers which are just highly localized and non-clinical. Low-level exposure to ionizing radiation may attenuate the process of developing cancer. So, this is possibly true also of certain toxic substances. It's very controversial. There's a lot of debate in the medical community about whether hormesis is a real thing. My suspicion is that there'll turn out to be some validity to it.